Welcome back to the InfoSec and Olsen Show. I'm your host, Josh Amishav. Every week on the show, we cover topics related to both offensive and defensive security. The goal is to share practical advice that you can use whether you're a red teamer, pen tester, or network defender. Today, we're going to cover AWS security and compliance with AJ Yawn. AJ is the co-founder and CEO of ByteCheck, and if you use AWS in any fashion, you'll want to listen to this episode. My three main takeaways from a conversation were: 1, how to make compliance not suck; 2, how to automate security within an AWS environment; and 3, what the shared responsibility model means when managing cloud infrastructure. You'll enjoy those 2 things, plus a bunch of other tips along the way. And now, here's my conversation with AJ. All right, so AJ, what is compliance?
Compliance is a way to verify that you're meeting some standard regulation or some requirement that's out there. It's a way to assess yourself against some baseline requirement. And nowadays in the B2B space, compliance is a way to grow your business. In order to do business with other businesses, you have to prove to them, hey, I'm not going to get breached. Your data is going to be secure with me. Here's a report showing why. And not necessarily that the report proves that, but you go through the exercise and your customers, investors, vendors are going to want some third party to come in and validate that you're compliant with whatever regulation they care about. And there's compliance, it's like security, it's contextual. If you're in the healthcare space, there's HIPAA compliance. If you're in the retail space, you have payment or PCI type of compliance. So it all changes depending on what industry you're in. But overall, you're just, being checked against some standards, and are you meeting them? Yes or no is really what compliance is all about.
So I imagine a lot of people listening to the show come from a security background, and we normally look at compliance as kind of as the low bar. Is that what, from your perspective, somebody who lives this day in and day out, is that what compliance is?
Yeah, I don't think it's a low bar, but I understand why security professionals think that's the case. And I think it's because of the way that compliance has been brought to organizations and to security professionals. You're just going about your life, you're doing your day job, you're protecting your company, and then randomly somebody comes and say, hey, I need a screenshot of this thing you're doing. And you're like, well, that doesn't prove anything. That's not actually real evidence. It's just a screenshot. That could be a screenshot of my friend's computer or my buddy's company, and it doesn't really actually show that I'm doing anything. And they're like, well, yeah, I know that it doesn't prove anything, but we really need it for this audit. And you're like, but the audit's for security. Why am I doing things that don't make sense for security? And eventually you just cave because you're just trying to get over with it, and you just give a screenshot. And next thing you know, your company is celebrating the fact that you received your audit report. And that's why people look at it as this low bar for security, because they realize that the traditional way of doing audits doesn't actually prove anything. But I do think there's an opportunity to shift that, where most of these compliance frameworks, whether you're talking SOC 2, ISO, PCI, HIPAA, HITRUST, the full alphabet soup there, most of them are saying the same things. They're saying do vulnerability scans and make sure you remediate any criticals or highs. Perform a pen test annually, patch your systems, make sure the right people have access that need to have access and no one that doesn't. They're all saying the same stuff and all of the same things that you care about from a security perspective. But oftentimes what happens is organizations get asked about a compliance framework and they don't care about context. They don't care about how you're currently doing something. They just say, we need to meet this compliance requirement, so just give me something to prove that I met this. Whereas the way to really think about compliance is, am I doing the basics of security? Am I doing the things that are necessary? Am I patching my systems? If I'm running a Windows shop, do I have any AV installed on my servers? Or if I'm running a Linux shop, what are my defense in depth strategy to prevent malicious software? Am I doing those basic things? And when you focus on that, you actually are going to have better security. You're going to have security principles that are relevant and going to help you solve whatever security problems you have. But at the output of that is going to be compliance. Like all these compliance frameworks are going to be met with you focusing on key security principles that we all know in the security industry that are important in an environment. But to answer your question, I think the mindset has been wrong when it comes to compliance because of the auditors, because auditors traditionally are not technical. So they're asking dumb questions. So everybody just runs away. And then it just becomes this kind of dog and pony show that no one really sees any value out of it.
Awesome. So how does compliance change when you move to the cloud?
It becomes easier and harder at the same time. So it becomes easier from a perspective of you should not be dealing with screenshots. There are too many APIs out there. There's too many different ways to pull in information programmatically. Full, kind of shameless plug here. We started a company to do that, right? To go ahead and connect to cloud providers and pull evidence in automatically. So from an evidence perspective and from a meeting compliance regulation perspective, it actually gets easier because the cloud allows you to share information in a rapid, interconnected, automated way. It becomes harder because visibility is really hard in the cloud. Someone can spin up a new EC2 instance with one simple command. I think it's like three words total. You can run an AWS command, and now you have a new EC2 instance. And that means resources change rapidly by the second. So compliance in traditional report, you see a compliance report, it says, I was compliant for the entire 12 months. My compliance status looks like this. In reality, all of us security professionals know compliance is up and down. It is a ever changing thing, and in the cloud that it becomes magnified because things change so fast. Resources are moving around, deleted, added. Developers are doing all kinds of crazy stuff in the cloud, and it's so easy to create new things that you have to really have a hold over what your environment is, what is your actual boundary of your environment in the cloud. And that's challenging just from a security perspective, and it's challenging to figure out what do I need to make compliant in my cloud environment. And I think it's challenging when you try to do it traditionally. A lot of folks out there are applying traditional audit principles to the cloud, and that just doesn't work. You have to leverage technology. You have to leverage some of these native cloud services, security services on different cloud providers to make your life easier and also to get you technically accurate information. A screenshot from AWS is probably the most useless screenshot ever known to man, because you can literally get a screenshot of an EC2 page showing security groups from anywhere. Does not prove that it's actually your account. And it's a regional service, so you're not even showing everything in your entire account anyways. But in the cloud, I think you have to leverage technology and automation, which has me excited because the audit industry finally is going to decide I have to leverage technology because the cloud providers are kind of forcing you to with how easy it is to change resources and do different things in the cloud.
So back in the day when you hosted all your own servers, you were kind of responsible for everything. When you move to the cloud, how does that responsibility change from client's perspective, what you need to take care of and what the provider takes care of?
Yeah, great question. And this is probably the biggest misconception when it comes to cloud security is a lack of understanding of what's called the shared responsibility model, which was created by AWS. And all the cloud providers have a version of the shared responsibility model, which essentially outlines who's responsible for what in the cloud. So in the old days, when you would go through your audit, one of the things your auditors have to do, and some auditors that have been doing this a while remember doing physical security checks, going into data centers and looking at raised floors or the environmental stuff, looking at dehumidifiers in the data centers and all that stuff. That's what the auditor has to do. They're going in there and they're pulling on locks, trying to pull and see if any of your cages are unlocked and all of that, fun physical security stuff. But now in the cloud, you don't have to do any of that. That's all gone because the cloud provider in the shared responsibility model says they're responsible for security of the cloud, whereas you as the customer are responsible for security in the cloud. And what does that mean? That means that the guest operating system that you're hosted on, you have to patch that. That means any users that you create, those are your users. If you allow everyone to have admin permissions, guess what? They can do admin level things, and AWS, GCP, or Azure are not going to stop them from doing those type of things. So when you think about security in the cloud and what changes from a responsibility perspective, a lot of it is the same. I think oftentimes people make mistakes because they think cloud security is different. They think, oh, AWS has a SOC 2 report, so I'm good to go. That's not the case. You still have to do all of the basics. You still have to worry about privileged users. You still have to check for vulnerabilities. You still have to update your servers, your instances. You still have to encrypt data at rest. The difference is now you don't have to actually manage the physical architecture, the physical infrastructure that's running it. And depending on your cloud computing model, that responsibility continues to shift as you use different cloud computing models. But at its core, all of the basics of running an application from a security perspective, minus the physical and environmental stuff, are still going to be your responsibility in the cloud when you're using the infrastructure as a service model.
Yeah, so I like that differentiation that you made. So they're responsible for what's on the cloud. You're responsible for what's in the cloud. That's a
Yep.
good way to think about it. When you follow the news, it seems to be like every day, or at least a couple times a week, you see these open S3 buckets, and it seems to be this plague that it's just so hard to take care of. What tools does AWS? I imagine this would be applicable for other cloud providers as well. How can a organization use the tools that are available to kind of prevent these misconfigurations?
Yeah, S3 bucket breaches are so frustrating. If anyone that's listening to this, if you just heard that from Josh and you're like, what is he talking about S3 bucket breaches? Just do a Google search and you will go down a rabbit hole that we probably won't see you for a few weeks because of how many links are out there, right? As with this stuff. And it's frustrating, especially for someone like me who lives and breathes AWS security every day, because it's so preventable. It's even more preventable now than it was years ago. And back then it was even preventable because there was ways that you could leverage services to automate this. So when it comes to S3 buckets, and I want to just take a little bit of time to frame this up, S3 is one of the oldest services on AWS. It's actually the oldest service on AWS. It's the first service they created to allow people to store stuff at infinite size. And if you think about Amazon, what they originally were, a bookstore, they were trying to figure out, how do I store all these digital things and have it at scale? So they created S3, which stands for Simple Storage Service, Object Storage in the Cloud. And a lot of times organizations are storing sensitive data like PII, credit cards, all kinds of sensitive stuff there in these buckets. And they will make the bucket public, which is what these breaches are. And a public bucket means that anyone with an AWS account can access this bucket and access all the data in it, depending on if you're allowing read or write permissions there. So they're allowing any hacker who has set up some automated script to search for public S3 buckets to go out there and retrieve your sensitive customer data. And this is a setting that is actually nowadays really hard to do. Like, it's really hard to, if you're in the console. In the CLI, it's actually really easy to make an public S3 bucket because that's the default. But in the console, it's a lot harder to do. And it used to be easier to do bad things, but AWS still allows you to do this. And once you make it public, like there was a study recently, somebody did like an IR test, and I think it was within like 3 minutes, their bucket was accessed from leaving it public. And it's crazy. And like somebody did something similar with access keys in GitHub. They deployed like some access keys, some AWS access keys to GitHub. They committed them to a public repo, and within like minutes, it was already compromised, that's how fast the bad actors are moving. But going back to how to protect this, on AWS, you can literally set with a few clicks of a button, whether you are a developer that loves to operate in the CLI, or if you are a novice on AWS and you just want to click through a web application and do it in the console, you can set it to where every single time an S3 bucket is created in your account, whether the settings are public or not, they will automatically revert it to a private bucket. And this is available to any AWS customer, and it's all available with some of their free security services, using things like AWS Systems Manager, using something that's called AWS Config as well, where you can auto-remediate these key security things. So I'll actually share, Josh, with you a link of a talk I did where I showed people how to fix S3 buckets without writing a line of code on AWS, because it is something that like keeps me up at night. Like, how are people still being breached and storing sensitive data when this is preventable? You could literally stop it from happening with a few clicks of a button and never have to worry about this again. So it's one of those things, and that's the cool thing about the cloud, but also the frustrating thing from a security perspective is it's so easy to automate security in the cloud. It's so easy to know this is an issue that I know is a problem, and this is what I'm going to do to make sure that, at least in my organization, that threat vector, that risk won't materialize because I've automated it.
What are the other tools that we can use to automate security in AWS?
I would definitely look at AWS Config because AWS Config has been built out to add auto remediation capabilities where you don't have to actually configure anything else. A lot of times people would use AWS Config, which is a rules engine, will go out and say you want all of your users to have MFA enabled. AWS Config will go out and check that regularly. Every time there's a new user added, do they have MFA enabled?
Is that only for specific regions, or you can set it up one time in config and it'll go out for every region?
So you have to set it up in a multi-region capacity. That's one problem I have with config is when you first set it up, if you want it to apply to multiple regions, you'll have to change that setting to make it a multi-region, and then it'll be on everywhere from that point moving forward. And you can roll it all up. If you're using AWS organizations with multiple accounts, you can roll it all up into one security account as well to go out and assess. It's essentially going to be like an inventory tool as well. It's going to assess every resource, security groups, IAM users, S3 buckets, IAM policies, and tell you whenever those resources change. And then when they change, you can trigger auto remediation activities, which uses Systems Manager underneath the hood. And Systems Manager is like an orchestration and configuration service on AWS that can go out and remediate S3 buckets, or it can go out and disable users access or deploy a new EC2 instance, or even it can run patches for you. Systems Manager is a service that you'll use for a lot of other security services to perform automatic remediation, because it does allow you to like run shell commands as well in an automatic fashion. And it's a lot easier now than a few years ago. A few years ago, you had to write Lambda functions for all this stuff. Anytime you wanted to auto remediate something, you'd have to write a Lambda function and your programming language of choice. And then you would be able to go out and fix these things, which now you don't have to do that anymore, which that was a fun time. And, it's cool to write those Lambda functions. But now literally anyone can do that with just a few clicks of a button, whether or not they are a programmer or not.
So talk a bit about authentication. How many users should you run in AWS? Like how many should you run everything from a single user? Do you want to separate permissions and have a couple? Like how do you handle that?
Yeah, you should definitely separate them out. Each individual person should have their own individual account tied to their name with multi-factor authentication enabled. There's a few basics that I would say you should do with authentication on AWS. First things first, your root account should be locked away forever. It's the first account you're going to get when you set up an account. Lock that thing away. You have the funds, get a hardware MFA token, put that in a file cabinet, and never use that account again. Create some admin users that can actually do admin functions. For every single user, I would ensure that they have MFA enabled. And there's actually an IAM policy that you can apply to a user or to a group called a force MFA policy, where if the user does not authenticate with MFA when they log into AWS, the policy will remove all of their permissions and only allow them to enable MFA. It's a very simple policy. It's another link I'll share with you, Josh, where I have the JSON for it that people can use. But that's a great way to say, if I'm a system administrator, I want every single person at my company to use MFA when they log into AWS. You apply this policy at the group level, and now every user will have to have MFA. And if they don't, they can't do anything, and you don't have to worry about it either. You can sleep at night. The other thing that I would do is use AWS organizations and create an individual people account. And this is an account where only your users live. So what you want to do there is make sure that when, say I'm a user, I'm AJ, my account was hacked because I didn't have this force MFA policy on there, and now a bad actor is in my account. They've accessed my AWS account. If I'm in this people account where the only thing I have are other users, and I have some service control policies, which are essentially guardrails you can put around an account, where you could say, this account can't do anything except manage their own credentials and then role switch to another account to perform like actual administrative functions. That bad actor breaks in and can't do anything. There's no resources. There's no customer data in this account. There's nothing there but other users. So AWS organizations is a way that you can segment out accounts. And one of those accounts should be like a people account where all your users live. And then when those users want to access other accounts, they'll do something called a cross-account access, where they use an identity and access management role to access those other accounts. And this limits blast radius of incidents, where your user account gets hacked, there's no sensitive data there. If something happens in a production account, maybe there's only compute resources in that account and none of your actual data stores are in that account. And you're able to segment things out so that when a bad event happens, we're in security, so it's not if, it's when. When a bad event happens, you're prepared and the impact of that event is minimal.
Awesome. That's great advice. If you wanted to mitigate, let's say, downtime, would you suggest setting up accounts in some Azure, some in AWS, some in perhaps in Google's cloud? How do you suggest to handle that?
Yeah, I'm not a fan of multi-cloud at all. I think it it will cause a lot of unnecessary stress on the team. I oftentimes think about stuff from a people perspective, and I'm like, you usually when you have a team of people, you're going to have experts on a certain cloud provider. And now when you say, hey, I want to run this workload in Azure, you're probably opening yourself up to some weaknesses and causing a lot of unnecessary stress on that individual. I'm just thinking about it from a selfish perspective. If I was a cloud admin somewhere and I'm working at a company and they're like, hey, AJ, like great work on AWS. You have our account running smoothly. We're going to put this workload on Azure. I'm going to go look for a new job because I know I'm going to struggle there. I know it's going to be difficult and I know I'm not going to be able to have the same protections. So from a people perspective, I don't recommend it. And from an actual operational perspective, it usually doesn't make a ton of like business sense. Most of the time, what you're solving for is resiliency, right? You want to make sure that if something happens, then you're going to be still able to run your application. All of the different cloud providers, they have geographically separate regions that are on separate power sources. So unless like we get hit by something that takes out like two different continents, you're probably going to be fine putting your data in one region in the US and another region in the EU. Or even if you want to just keep it all in the US, one in Oregon and one in Virginia. There's been a lot of AWS outages over the years, but they've been region-based outages. They haven't been global outages that have taken out the entire AWS network or Azure network or whatever network it may be. So most of the time, you can solve those resiliency problems in one cloud provider, keep your people happy, but also maintain that central management. As soon as you add multiple clouds, you're probably going to start finding SaaS solutions out there that you got to buy to connect everything together because you're going to have to figure out how do I get security information from Azure and AWS into one place. That's a tool. And that's another expense that you're probably going to have to put between there. Whereas if you keep everything in one cloud provider, you can roll everything up in one account, leveraging as many of those native services as possible and not need to have all these other different SaaS apps out there. And all of us security professionals have seen like kind of that SaaS creep that happens at organizations when they get a little bit of money and they just start buying every tool on demand. And now you have all these tools and you're not using any of them. So I highly recommend against multi-cloud. And usually when I have clients thinking about it, I try to dive into the why. Like, what are you trying to solve here? What's the problem you think you're solving by going multi-cloud? And most of the times I can talk them out of it by showing them how to do things on one cloud provider. There are use cases that make sense from a government perspective or regulation perspective that maybe a customer is in Azure and you've been in AWS and they're like, no, this app needs to be in Azure for us to use it. Sometimes it makes sense, but most of the time I think one cloud provider with separate geographic regions, separating out accounts or subscriptions allows you to solve for those problems.
Cool. AWS seems to release new tools all the time. How do you follow what all the tools are and what best practices are?
Yeah, it's hard because you're right. They do release new stuff all the time. And I feel like I know a little bit about AWS, but I feel like there's a lot I don't know. And people oftentimes will be like, oh, AJ's an AWS expert. And I'm like, I don't know, man. I don't know if I'm an expert. There's a lot more to learn. And they probably created a new service while we were on this podcast that I don't know anything about. There's a couple of cloud security newsletters that I read regularly. One is by a guy named Marco Lancini. He runs one called Cloud Seclist, I believe. That's really, really good. Another guy named Clint Gibler. He has a cloud security newsletter called TLDRSec, which is a really good newsletter that keeps me updated. I subscribe to the AWS security blog alert. So whenever AWS releases a new blog announcing something, I'll get a notification in Slack about that. And then there's another guy named Corey Quinn who releases this newsletter called Last Week in AWS. That's really good as well. But even with all of those sources, it's still hard to keep up. So I think if anyone's trying to keep up with the cloud and knowledge, if you feel overwhelmed, that's normal. Us people that you think have it all together, we feel overwhelmed too. And we're still trying to figure out what's going on. It's a lot of information and they innovate so fast and they change things. There's videos of the internet of me showing people how to fix something in AWS and it's completely outdated now. And that was probably like just a year ago. So things change so fast, but that's what I think makes it cool and it keeps me interested. Is the fact that it changes so much that I never really feel comfortable, that I'm constantly learning, which definitely keeps it fun.
It definitely keeps it interesting. Now, there were kind of the two reasons why I really wanted to have you on the podcast. One of them is your slogan, right? You're making compliance suck less. Love the slogan. How do you make compliance suck less?
Yeah, so I think compliance sucks for a few reasons. One, it's time consuming. You're wasting people's times with conference rooms, long meetings. I guess nowadays it's just Zoom meetings with auditors. And the other piece is that no one sees any value from it. The security professionals are like, this is a waste of time. The compliance manager is essentially just becomes a project manager that is organizing kind of herding cats and making sure people are showing up for meetings on time, and no one's getting any value out of it. They're not, but the organization is spending thousands of dollars and 3, 4 months of people's time. So it's a huge investment. And that's why it sucks, because people are dreading the exercise, and exercise that it takes a lot of time, costs a lot of money, and they're not getting better from it. They're not getting security value. So at BiteCheck, we built a platform that takes away some of the nonsense that goes into audits, like evidence collection and screenshots, by connecting directly to an AWS, Azure, GCP, some other cloud tools like GitHub and Bitbucket and Jira, to go out and pull that evidence automatically. We know exactly the type of evidence you got to provide for your auditors, because I was an auditor in my past life. So I lived and breathed this stuff, and I knew there was a better way. I knew there was an easier way to go through these assessments. So we built a tool to help with that. But beyond automating evidence collection, our real goal is to help you produce technically accurate information for the audit. We know these audits matter. They help close deals. They are communicating out to your customers how you're securing their data. So we want to make sure, and we do with our platform, that your report reflects that it actually reflects a cloud security, cloud environment, and you're not getting this cookie cutter report that your auditor has issued to every single customer they ever worked with, whether they are hosted on AWS or Azure. A good sniff test about whether or not your compliance exercise sucked. If you're hosted on AWS and you got a SOC 2 report, and you look in your report and you don't see anything about S3 buckets, you just heard Josh and I talk about how many breaches there are and how big of a risk S3 buckets are. You would think that a $30,000 to $50,000 report that's focused on security would cover S3 buckets, but you will be surprised at how many reports you'll find of people hosted on AWS that says nothing about the biggest threat of someone hosted in the cloud. And that's why compliance sucks. People go through these exercises and then they don't even look at the most important thing from a security perspective. And we make sure that we do that. We're connecting directly to those cloud providers. So we're testing things like access keys in public code repos. We're testing S3 bucket public access. We're testing whether or not you're backing up your EBS volumes. All these different things that actually matter from a cloud security perspective, we're going out and testing. And then we're applying that to your compliance framework. So we do all the compliance mapping and nonsense for you. And all you have to do is worry about building your application, and the compliance stuff will work itself out. And that's really the goal of our platform, is to take away all the hard stuff so you can focus on security, focus on running your company, and let the compliance stuff take care of itself after you're done with all of that.
So you mentioned that you were an auditor in a previous life. What would you look for if someone needs to choose an auditor? What kind of things that should they look for? How do they know that their auditor has the right skills to audit their networks?
Treat it like going to the doctor. If you had a serious foot problem and you went to your primary care doctor, you would ask them to refer you to a foot specialist. You wouldn't go to a heart doctor for a foot problem, right? But a lot of times people go to get an audit from a non-cloud auditor, and they're hosted in the cloud. And they're trying to ask this auditor who's used to doing on-prem audits to assess my cloud environment. And that just is a tough thing to do for anyone. So I think when you're going through the audit questionnaire and finding an auditor, worry less about time, worry less about cost and how long that's going to take and all that, and focus on, is this auditor the right for my technology stack? The same way when you hire someone, you're going to say, what do you know about AWS if you're hosting on AWS? Or what do you know about Azure if you're hosting on Azure? Ask your auditor. And not only what do they know about it, but how does their knowledge apply to your audit? What did they learn about AWS's Trusted Advisor report or IAM credential report that taught them how to reduce evidence collection for you, that taught them how to make this process easier for you? Or what are some of the security tips they're going to give you from those cloud providers to help you out in your assessment? That's the key questions to ask. But I think right now, most people ask, how long is this going to take and how much is this going to cost me? Very important questions. But if you find out that they actually know the technology you're using, it's going to cost you less and it's going to take less time. So you're going to get your end goal of reducing cost and time by working with auditors that actually understand your technology. oftentimes you're going to work with someone that they just don't know what a security group is. So they're asking you for firewall rule sets, and you're like, I don't have a firewall, I have security groups. Don't do that. Don't waste that. Don't waste your time going through that conversation, because there's enough good auditors out there that do understand technology, and you just have to find them. And that's going to make the process so much easier, and less focus on time and cost, but more focus on technical capabilities.
Awesome. So I always like to ask when we have entrepreneurs on the show, your thoughts, any advice for somebody who wants to start their own security company?
Woo, security is hard. I would take a hard look and see if you really actually want to sell security. Just because cybersecurity is built on trust, cybersecurity professionals are naturally skeptical. So you're going into an industry and you're selling software to CISOs that are already don't trust you because you're a security vendor. So you're starting from behind the power curve. But what I would say is it's really rewarding when you have a security professional that respects what you're doing and respects what you've been able to build in this space. It means a lot more than if you're selling in marketing or sales or something else, because you know how skeptical security professionals are. But my biggest piece of advice would be learn the industry, learn the product, learn whatever it is that you're doing in and out before you start a company. A lot of the things that we went through at BiteCheck and have gone through, I've been through in my previous jobs or have experienced firsthand over and over and over again. So that muscle memory, those experiences have helped me navigate situations that I think a lot of times if I didn't have that experience, I don't the company might not be here, because I would have thought it was the end of the world. But I knew kind of what the speed bump was going to be. I knew what the hurdles were going to be. And that all came through experience. I'm pretty sure I knew about 2 years ago or so, maybe 3 years ago, that I was going to start my own company at some point. I didn't necessarily have the idea fleshed out. I didn't necessarily know exactly what it was going to be or what it was going to be called, but I knew I was an entrepreneur. I knew I had that in me, and I knew I wanted to do it. And when I shifted that mindset at my last company, I started taking more chances. I started taking more risks, because I realized these are risks I'm taking on someone else's dime, and they're not my customers. It's not my company. It's someone else's company. So if I fail, it's not that big of a deal. It's a paycheck. It's not necessarily my lifetime calling. And that allowed me to do a lot of really cool things, because I wasn't scared of failure. I wasn't scared to step out and try something new, because I was, it was free practice for me, essentially. I was just taking free shots. It was all shooting free throws in a gym by yourself, and then you get in front of a stadium full of people when you're running your own startup, and you want to make those. But you can miss those. You can miss a few when you're in the gym by yourself. So that mindset shift helped me gain that experience, and that's what I would encourage anybody that is thinking about starting a company: is get your experience underneath someone else's dime. Figure out your value props underneath someone else's dime, and learn and cultivate those skills, because when it's your own, it's your own, and the stakes are never higher when you're running your own thing, and you want to make sure that you're not going to know every situation or every circumstance that you're going to run into, but you can get a lot of great experience when you shift to an entrepreneurial mindset when you're working for someone, then trying to jump out and immediately think you can turn it on. It takes a special type of decision making and decisiveness to be an entrepreneur, and you should definitely work those muscles out before you start something.
Can you give an example when you say change the entrepreneurial mindset while you're working for someone else? What's an example of that?
Yeah, so when I was at my last firm, I realized there was an opportunity when we were evaluating some software companies we were working with, and we were starting some new practice lines around it, and there was really no leader to lead this up. There was no one to lead up the partnership, take on building out sales functionality, marketing, and all this other stuff. And I stepped up and said, "Hey, I'll do this," even though I had no experience, had no knowledge, and it was completely different than what I was doing at that company. And I only did it solely because I saw it as a learning opportunity. I was like, this is a great way for me to learn how to build some of these functions, how to actually apply some of these future entrepreneurial skills of meeting with third parties, talking to customers regularly to get feedback. And I knew at that point I was going to probably do something in software. So I wanted to get closer and closer to software CEOs and talk to them and figure out how did they think, how did they make decisions. So it was, and I don't think I did well at it, to be quite honest. I wasn't the greatest at the job, but that didn't matter to me. What mattered was the experience. And I think that's the key takeaway is try things out when you're at an employer. It's a lot easier for an employer to give you, an internal employee, a project or a hard initiative than it is to hire someone from the outside. Whether you fail or not, it's cheaper just to do it internally. So take advantage of that if you're at a company and see if you can get some experience and some exposure to things that you're going to need when you become a founder. Sales is so important as a founder. You have to sell no matter how technical you are or how great you think you are with technology. If you start a company, you will sell, and you have to sell a lot. That's going to be one of your most important aspects of your job. So learn how to do sales. Learn how to talk to customers and sell, whether it's the same value prop you have or not, but selling your solution, because that skill is necessary. And take your losses underneath someone else's. You can have a 0% close rate at someone else's company, and then when you get to your own company, you can get to 100%. So I think the mindset shift is being not scared to fail, because you realize the stakes that you're going to in the future are so much higher. So you're willing to take those risks when you're at another company.
Awesome. Great advice. So if someone wants to follow you, where can they find you?
Yeah, I'm the most active on LinkedIn. I'm picking up my Twitter activity here and going to continue to grow that. But LinkedIn's probably the best place to find me. I do LinkedIn Lives on a regular basis where I'm, just talking to the community or bringing someone in to interview them. And feel free to reach out, either shoot me a LinkedIn message or a Twitter DM. And I'm fairly good at responding. I say fairly. I used to be a lot better, but it's kind of crazy now. But I'm fairly good at responding, and I enjoy meeting new people. I really enjoy mentoring. I spend about 4 hours a week mentoring people and sharing tips and advice for different folks in the industry trying to break in, because we need more people in cybersecurity, and we can't solve this skills gap that's out there by just hiring a bunch of qualified people or a bunch of people that look the same. We got to get more diverse and more different types of people with different types of experiences into this field. So I'm happy to help whenever I can and encourage people to reach out. I try to be as approachable as I can, as I was when I was a junior consultant back a few years ago. So, or podcasts like this is a great place to learn about me and my story as well. So I appreciate you having me on, Josh.
Awesome. Thanks so much for coming on the show. All right, that's it for this week. Thanks again for listening and leaving reviews. And if you have any comments or questions, I'd love to hear from you. I'm at Jamoose on Twitter, or drop me an email at podcast@breachsense.io. And if you're part of a security team that needs visibility into your clients, employees, or third-party suppliers' breach credentials before criminals exploit them, head on over to breachsense.io to apply for a free 7-day trial. That's it for this week, and I'll be back in your earbuds next Thursday morning.